This is a story that I've been waiting to tell for a very long time. So I'm a farm girl from the United States of America. I'm from where Illinois and Iowa meet on the corner of the Mississippi River. And I was homeschooled. I come from an amazing family. I have one sister. I had a great, awesome upbringing. I don't come from a household of abuse, and I don't have a history of abuse when I was a child. That's kind of a little bit of my background. I always felt a little bit out of place. I think I wanted to leave the farm about, I don't know, age 3. I started thinking I had bigger plans in my head at age 3. And I was really grateful to do this podcast because it gave me an opportunity to sort of look back and to look at the patterns that sort of led me to being trafficked. Yeah, I started going to punk rock concerts, and at the Vans Warped Tour in Chicago, Illinois, I met a photographer that said that he wanted to make me a star, and he thought that I had the potential to have a modeling career. He was from Los Angeles, and this moment was pretty much the beginning of the end. I flew to Los Angeles not long after that. My mother accompanied me because I was a minor. Anybody that would ever see a picture of me would know that it's not that I'm not an attractive person. I just don't have supermodel qualities. So it's not that I'm unattractive. So the fact that I bought into that just shows how vulnerable I was at a young age and how much I just wanted to be a part of the world. I had been on this farm. I had felt like I was meant for more. I really wanted to be something great. On that trip, I was groomed for what would happen later. On that trip, I was sexually assaulted under the influence of drugs, and I didn't know that I could talk to my family about it. I didn't know that there were resources available, and I really didn't have anyone to talk to, so I stayed quiet about it. I went back home to the farm. My attitude got even more maybe aggressive, but I was always that way. I was always a fighter with my poor parents. I put them through the ringer. I finished my education early because of being homeschooled, and the same photographer that had assaulted me introduced me to a high profile musician. The high profile musician said, "Come out to Los Angeles. We'll start a music career. You're going to be a model. You're going to be a musician. You're going to be famous." And I believed it. So before I turned 18, my father drove me out to Los Angeles. I know a lot of folks are going to blame my family when they hear this, but the truth is my family knew that they couldn't control me. I was going to do it either way. So that's just kind of the way that went down. When I got to Los Angeles, within 48 hours, I was addicted to a drug that I only know as ice. Now I'm 39 years old. Back then I was 17. It started off with the famous musician offering me a couple beers. I wanted to be cool. I wanted to fit in. I didn't really know any better. I hadn't come from an environment where drinking and drugs were a part of my history. After I had had a little bit of cocktails, the drugs were offered. I was under the influence, and then the serious grooming started. In retrospect, I really just wanted to please everyone because I really wanted to be famous. It sounds funny now to say it because now that's the last thing that I want. But I just wanted to be cool. I really just wanted to be cool. I think there are a lot of times where I could have said something, but I didn't even know who I would have talked to about it. I didn't want to break my parents' heart. They had put so much behind me and everything that they thought I could be. I didn't want to break their heart by calling them and telling them the truth. So the gentleman who promised me the world ended up selling me after a couple days. I was sold for $500 to a very older gentleman in the hills. And this gentleman ran it was definitely it was a trafficking ring. It was a prostitution trafficking ring. And so that was basically the ultimate beginning of the end, was when I was sold to that guy. So this isn't a day before cell phones. This isn't a day pre 9/11. Can you believe it? This is quite a while ago. I didn't really have the tools, the resources, and I was also extremely vulnerable. I didn't have a job. I had no connections in Los Angeles. I had no friends in Los Angeles. I was there completely alone. So going to the authorities, I had never gone to the authorities before about anything in my entire life. At that point in it, I would have thought that if I would have gone to the authorities, that it was my fault. And that is one area that a lot of survivors struggle,
Mm.
is they think that it's their fault. They think that they have a role
Mhm.
to play in it. That was just the beginning of the journey. I was so difficult for the gentleman that purchased me to handle that he actually gave me back to the original person for free, gave me back to the original person that had sold me, and that person left me for dead in a hallway after an extremely heavy excursion. I ended up in Cedar Sinai Hospital of an apparent drug overdose, and I'm very grateful for the EMTs that took care of me that day and for the folks at Cedar Sinai. I don't think I was transparent with them about what had happened. I think I was just seen as a drug addict, which is fine. I don't know if I would have had the words. That's the difficult thing. You know, I didn't even identify as a
Yeah.
trafficking survivor until I was on my way to the first a safe house for that. I didn't. It took somebody kind of
Mhm.
telling me what trafficking really was for me to understand what it was. I had a before somebody really broke it down for me. I thought trafficking was only, you know, my folks that were migrating, that were like stuck in semis, in the back of semis, like people that were coming from other countries. I had absolutely no concept of what trafficking was. So I wouldn't have identified as a trafficking survivor, even if it had been presented to me. They released me from the hospital and I flew back to the farm. I called my parents on a 911, and I'll never forget that. I rolled back home with a trash bag. And keep in mind, this wasn't long after my father had dropped me off. When I got off the plane, they didn't even recognize me when they came to get me. After I got it together a little bit, I mean, it was maybe 2 weeks that I spent back on the farm getting it back together. I flew back to Los Angeles because I had moved there. And within a couple hours, I remember contacting the same person that had done the original trafficking. Fortunately for me, they didn't accept my calls. I'm assuming it was because I was such a handful. I was pretty difficult to deal with, even at any stage of being trafficked. I think one thing that saved my life continuously is that I was really difficult to deal with. When I went back to Los Angeles, I changed the people, places, and things, and I really started on a path of healing and recovery. I had started to get my life together a little bit, and I had met my what would turn out to be my husband. I got married at a very young age. That marriage was an abusive relationship. That was a domestic violence situation. He had joined the military and we had moved to Germany. When I got back to the United States, I left the domestic violence relationship and we ended up getting a simplified dissolution, which in the state of California just means you agree to disagree and you get divorced. And I had entered another relationship. That relationship ended in a very heartbreaking way. I sort of went back to my trauma brain. I was really vulnerable. And part of being vulnerable led me back to being trafficked again. I didn't go back to my original traffickers. I don't even know where they are. I have absolutely no idea where they are. I ran into a crowd with a new set of traffickers. I mean, we would call them pimps. A lot of times we call them pimps, but that's what they are. They're pimps or traffickers. And I was vulnerable. I had the right set of vulnerabilities to be trafficked again. And unfortunately, I fell back into the life. You would think that after being an adult and having a few more tools that I would have still reached out, but I didn't. I didn't. It took me years. It took me a lot of years to reach out. But after I was an adult, years after, when I fell back into the lifestyle, when I fell back into the game, I always had a cell phone. I always had ability to walk the streets. I always had ability to walk into a police department, and I just never did. You're actually theirs. You are theirs. Everything that you make financially goes back to them. They'll make sure that your basic needs are met just so that you can survive and continue to make money for them. So that's what type of trafficking situation I was in the second go around. Fortunately, I hit a couple breaking points, and I think that a lot of it has to do with the brave folks that walked before me. Fortunately, human trafficking over the past 2 years has come to the forefront and the public eye. There started popping up nonprofits that were willing to talk about it, started popping up safe houses that were willing to talk about it. And one of those nonprofits had dropped off a beautiful stack of Bibles one night to a gentleman's club that I was being trafficked out of. I saw the stack of Bibles and I asked the manager, if I could have one. What I didn't realize when I asked the manager if I could have one was that there was an email address on the back. Actually, it was a website. Sorry, I misspoke. There was a website on the back of the Bible. Beautiful pink little Bible. But they had on the back put this website. And I held on to that website information in that Bible for a year and a half before I reached out for help. And that website contained a nonprofit. And after, I don't really even know what the breaking point was, because I had been beaten up so many times. I had been sexually assaulted so many times. I had been, black eyes, permanent scars on my face, teeth chipped. I mean, anything you could possibly think of it happened. Drugged. I was drugged so many times. I had gone to the police a lot of times. But something one night just, it was like I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't freaking take it anymore. And I said, you know what? I'm just going to go on this website of this freaking Bible and see what they're talking about. And there was an email address on that website. And I shot that organization an email. I was living on the west side of Chicago. Anybody that knows anything about the west side of Chicago knows it's not the best part. I was living on a gang line. People knew, like I said, I mean, my life wasn't my own. I was living, but I wasn't truly living. I was an empty shell of a human. I wanted to die. I didn't really have the guts to act on my thoughts or feelings. And there was just something inside of me that kept telling me, like, this isn't it. But I sent that email. I sent that email to that organization. And let me tell you, that organization stepped all the way up. Within a couple hours, an advocate, my first advocate, was moving my stuff out of the apartment while I was at work in the middle of the night. And I kept thinking, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe these people are for real. I can't believe that somebody cares this much about me and about my life. I kept thinking that this might be a joke. It might be a setup. And I just couldn't believe that anybody was that nice. And they were that legit. They were that nice. And I owe them quite a bit. And I ended up going to a safe house. I was literally like whisked away. My first trip to LA, originally I was 16. And this day that I'm talking about, I was already in my 30s. I did go to a safe house that's designed for survivors of human trafficking, folks that are leaving all forms of human trafficking, including leaving trafficking from within the porn industry. And I lasted for 3 months. It's about a 2-year program, and I only lasted for 3 months. Like I said, I've always been pretty rebellious. I've always been pretty wild, and I like to do things my way. I thought I had a better way. I thought I was healed after 3 months, and I was wrong. Within 2 days of leaving that safe house, I was already back with my trafficker. One thing that was so alluring about my trafficker at this point was that he was high profile. So I'll say this, and then we'll just leave that where it is. He's a high profile athlete. So I bounced back and forth a little bit, but what's so amazing about that original reaching out for help is that folks started to plant seeds. And once those seeds of truth are planted in your head, traffickers start to lose their mojo, so to speak. People had started planting those seeds, and even though I wasn't fully ready to accept the free gift yet, I was starting to get back a little bit of my self-worth and really, truly what I was intended and meant to do. And I had amazing women specifically just really telling me about my potential and telling me what I could be. And that really worked against what traffickers had been feeding me for a long time, what pimps had been feeding me for a long time. But what these women were telling me was, actually, you're kind of awesome, Eliza, and you don't need anybody. And in a few years, you're going to help a lot of people, but first you got to get your act together. And I was always super, super rebellious. So it was hard to accept that free gift. I've just always been a really wild spirit. So it was hard. I did go back, but like I said, it was challenging for my traffickers to get in my head after that because those seeds had been planted. I think a big tipping point for me was just, I started to see what was really going on. And at a point when I got The boyfriend, I said, okay, enough is enough. And I walked away. I always said I would leave the life if I met somebody that I truly loved, and I did. I think another big tipping point for me was when my nephew was born. I didn't want him to lose his aunt to the streets. After my relationship had ended with the boyfriend, I decided to stay on the farm, and I really started to get the healing. It started flooding in, but it took a really long time. And I want all the survivors to know that they hear this. It just took a long time. It wasn't like a bat of an eyelash. If you mix sort of, sexual assault, repeated sexual assault, and domestic violence, that's a lot what human trafficking looked like for me. I truly feel like my going back and forth between the life and then getting it together and going back and getting it together and going back, I feel like that made me better equipped for doing what I'm doing now. And I never want to rob another survivor of their experience. And that's why I never push a survivor to follow the exact same path that I found, because for all I know, they need to have their own experience. So I'm grateful for people that never forced me to do anything. I kind of had to decide to end all of this shenanigans on my own. I was embarrassed. Like, it's pretty embarrassing. Like, even now, as a 39-year-old woman sitting here on this podcast, like, this is not my favorite thing to talk about. But I started to volunteer. And then after I volunteered for a while, the second organization that I was volunteering for decided to send me to further my education so that I could better serve survivors. I studied how to be a survivor advocate. So basically, I'm like a social worker light in the United States. I call it social worker light. So I work, I got trained on how to work with sexual assault, domestic violence, human trafficking, and other violent crimes. We studied the law, we studied survivors' rights, we studied everything. I'm so grateful that I did that, because it changed my verbiage and it changed my dialogue on how I speak to survivors. Even after I decided to be a volunteer, even after I decided to do that continuing education and become a certified survivor advocate, which is really important because I don't even have a GED. So for me, even that was pretty amazing. For me, that was a big hurdle. So that was already pretty awesome to just be able to do that. I was already starting to gain a sense of empowerment. But after I started doing direct advocacy with survivors, I was around a lot of folks that were sort of perpetuating a victim mentality type of energy. They were sort of installing this victim mentality in me, that I hadn't played a part in anything that had happened, that everything that happened to me was a result of abuse. And they also didn't want me to take personal responsibility for anything that had happened. They didn't want me to really look at it for exactly what it was. And I have very unpopular ideas as far as the survivor movement is concerned now. Some of those views include personal responsibility. I had to look back and say, okay, what was my part in this? Not when I was a child. Anytime before the age of 18, I do not take responsibility for. After I turned 18, and after things happen after that, I can honestly say I do play a role in what's going on around me. And there were moments where I could have chosen to handle things differently, and I didn't. So, although bad things happen to me, I am also capable of doing really horrible things. Those two things can be true at the same time. But it took Jordan B. Peterson, it took me really paying attention to Jordan B. Peterson to really realize all of that. The day that FOSTA SESTA was passed, FOSTA SESTA is part of Section 230 of the American. Anyway, you can Google FOSTA SESTA if you choose. I decided I need to learn to use the dark web, because we feared when FOSTA SESTA was passed that a lot of sex workers and trafficking victims and survivors would be trafficked through the dark web, which they have been and are. The dark web is a layer of the internet that isn't easy to access for the average person. If you think of the internet as an onion, you and I are on a surface layer now, and the dark web is below the surface. It's an area where a lot of things, nefarious activities can go on, like illegal activities. You can basically buy and sell anything that you want to in the entire world on the dark web. I went searching for one thing and I found another thing. And let me tell you, that one interview that I found inadvertently set the tone for the rest of my healing. I was already on an amazing path for healing, but that was definitely a turning point for me. At the time when I looked him up, I was suicidal. I was living in fear. I was heavily medicated. I was in a really, really rough spot because when you're a survivor and you decide that you want to work with survivors, you are constantly under attack. I was really, I'm not going to lie, I was really triggered, after I had gone to do the education while I was working with survivors, because you have to understand, like, we see survivors. I mean, we deal with children. We're in the emergency room. We see suicide attempts. I had in 1 week seen a suicide attempt. I had written a victim impact statement with a 10-year-old. This is all in the course of a week. So I was pretty triggered. And I had not yet been put in a position to realize that I had a say in what was going on. Needless to say, after starting to pay attention to Jordan B. Peterson and the rest of the intellectual dark web, I learned about what happened in our country and in our world's history. And the wild part was when I looked at the picture as a whole, I realized this wasn't even as bad as it's been in history. And I also learned that by facing my own fears and that by facing my own past and that by, for lack of better terms, cleaning up my own room before I fix the world. I mean, all these things rung so true to me. Stand up straight with your shoulders back. All of these things, take personal responsibility. These weren't things that were being told to me. These were not things that were being told to me. What was being told to me was, you're a victim. Everything that happens to you is wrong. Everything. It was just keeping me in this place of being sick. My brain was sick. I really started to get a lot of healing. I don't push my particular brand of healing on survivors because where I'm at today is not where I was when I came out of the game. I don't push my thoughts or views or anything on survivors. I give them facts. I give them resources. If they ask me a question about my experience, I'll definitely tell them, especially if I think that it'll help them knowing that someone understands. When I meet with a survivor for the first time, I say that I'm also a survivor of human trafficking and I leave it there. I don't say, well, you have to do this. You have to believe in this God. You have to do this. I let survivors know that I have their back regardless. When you're a person with purpose and a person with meaning, you don't want to die. You want to live as long as humanly possible so that you can help as many folks as possible. I'm just a regular person that went through a lot of junk so that I can maybe help the next person that's going through a lot of junk. I always say they were going to victim mentality me to death. I was about to victim mentality myself to death. I was blaming every single thing that was going on wrong in my life on those original experiences and on all the people that had done me bad. But the truth is, I was living in the past. I was living in the past. I cannot change the past. All I can change is what I do from this moment forward. Like I said, I wasn't alone. I had a lot of amazing people that planted those seeds along the way. And every single person that planted a seed, I have thanked them publicly, privately. I've thanked a lot of people. I owe a lot of thank yous. And one of the ways that I show them my gratitude is by continuing to show up for the next set of survivors, by doing this podcast. This is part of me showing the brave people that stood up for me gratitude and just thanking them, because hopefully someone is inspired and motivated by this podcast. Hopefully, I mean, my goal, brutal honesty, and even doing this is that some survivor somewhere, whether it be a past or present trauma or domestic violence situation, human trafficking situation, I hope that this podcast reaches someone that needs to hear it, and that they may not even realize the situation that they're in, but that it'll encourage them to reach out for help.